fellow humanists. My name is Todd Kimball. It's an honor to be your MC this morning. But a reminder that humanism is a rational philosophy informed by science, inspired by arts, and motivated by compassion. It advocates the extension of participatory democracy and the expansion of an open society standing for human rights and social justice. Today's reader is the organizer of the readers, or as I like to refer to him, the Lord of the readers, Mr. Al Christians.
Okay, here I am. I'm the reader of last resort again today. Take that as a message. Sign up for reading. Our reading today is from raptitude.com from November of 2022. Snakes are real, but most of them are sticks. The human mind tends to fill in the blanks with bad things. This is negativity bias, which helped keep our ancestors alive by having us mistake sticks for snakes, for example, to make sure that when it's a real snake, we don't think it's a stick. We inherited a mind tuned for false positives. The human mind sees a dark room and habitually populates it with monsters, barely aware that it doesn't actually know what's there, that the darkness is the not seeing, the not knowing. So how do we know when we're being fooled? We don't. Because the boogeymen we believe in seem real, at least as real as Pluto or Antarctica or any other off-screen phenomena. But there are clues. We can start by assuming that any news, activism, or political speech, right or wrong, is freely employing boogeymen. To be in the rhetoric business and not bother with boogeymen would be like being a chef and not bothering with a stove. The boogeyman is a natural tool that we use it intuitively and inadvertently. Once one of them makes it into your worldview, he's in your world. And as far as you can tell, in a sea of fools, no one is an island. Theoretically, it's possible that you are perfectly appraising a given thread in the world in all its complexities, whether it's that of neo-Marxists, neo-Nazis, pedophilia rings, transphobes, gun people, anti-gun people, critical theory, food additives, COVID, incels, botulism, vaccination enthusiasts, vaccination critics, Chinese spyware, baseball caps being worn indoors, or the retrograde motion of the planet Mercury. This seems unlikely, though, when you consider how often you witness people around you getting important things wrong, oversimplifying them, falling for a headline bait, or making false equivocations. Unless part of your worldview is that you are a truly exceptional member of the species, above the self-delusion that so clearly afflicts everyone else, you can't responsibly take for granted that you have things right. It's hard to evaluate your own worldview because being wrong feels exactly like being right. A certain uncomfortable agnosticism seems to be the most logical position, but it's hard to sit in the dark like that, knowing that you don't know. One thing we can believe is that our minds are highly susceptible to the story of the simple, morally uncomplicated monster. And also that the internet makes all this much worse. Social media allows virtually anyone to find a lurid example of the things you fear most. Real, fabricated, or some combination, put it in front of you and say, see, your fears are true. Your snake-making brain will do the rest. The word boogeyman makes these monsters sound slow and dopey and easy to spot. I suspect that most of the time they look exactly like the world as we know it.
Thank you, Al. A timely reading which relates well to today's topic. Today's media landscape is fragmented and fraught with conflict. Journalists contend with increasing political extremism and hostility, continued layoffs and cutbacks. Oregon has been hit hard by the downsizing and closure of local media outlets, particularly outside the Portland metro area. However, there's reason for hope and optimism with the growth of new online outlets and nonprofits filling in some gaps. Our presenter this morning, Rachel Alexander, is the managing editor at the Salem Reporter, an online local news site in Salem. She covers a mix of news about the city, local nonprofits, and schools. She previously worked for local newspapers in Spokane and Walla Walla and has spent a decade in the news industry. She is the Freedom of Information Chair for Oregon Society of Professional Journalists. Journalists have had to be tough these days, and Rachel hones that toughness by playing roller derby in her spare time. Let's have a rousing ovation from those at the Friendly House and a warm yet muted welcome from our Zoom audience for Rachel Alexander.
All right. Thank you all so much for having me and for that lovely introduction. Can folks hear me okay? We good?
We got you.
All right. Yeah. Gosh, it's always so hard to plan talks like this because there's so many things to talk about, and there were a lot of wonderful questions of epistemology and bias in that introduction. My talk doesn't get quite into that territory, but I would love to hit all of that in Q&A, and I'll leave y'all ample time for that. Yeah, as Todd mentioned, so I'm the managing editor at Salem Reporter. So we're a very small, scrappy team of journalists in the Capitol, and we are 5 years old and kind of struggled to find our footing at the beginning, but what we've really settled on is being local news for Salem. So not trying to cover the Capitol and the ledge and state government as much, though we do some of that, obviously, because it's very intertwined with the city, but really being a quality local news source for what's going on, city, county, schools, all that kind of bread and butter basic stuff that's been cut back a lot in recent years. So I manage a team of 2 other reporters, and we do our best to compete with the local daily newspaper with our little tiny staff. I also was previously the president of the Oregon Society of Professional Journalists during 2020. So I got to lead that through the start of the pandemic and through the summer 2020 protests and a couple of federal lawsuits and a lot of complaints with Portland police over tear gassing journalists and other things like that. Not going to touch on that too much in my presentation, but just throwing that out there in case folks have questions about any of that. And with that little intro, I will get going on my slides. Let me see if I remember how to do this. Okay. You'd think as a journalist, I'd be really good at Zoom, but I'm always joining Zooms that other people have created instead of my own because, yeah, so this is kind of my headline here is that the state of the news is grim, but not without cause for optimism. And I do really believe that, or I wouldn't have been in this business for 10 years and sticking with it. So what I want to talk about today is kind of how the media got to this particular moment in time where we're very downsized and do not have the bodies and the people to do what we should be doing, and a lot of publications are in trouble, but also I think from a historic low kind of on an upswing toward rethinking a lot of important things and focusing in on what really matters, and then kind of what that means for you all as civically engaged, informed members of the public, and for democracy in general. So the media is a really huge amorphous term that covers like all of these different outlets and many, many more. There's publications that report news, there's publications that report on people reporting the news. There's a lot of opinion, there's a lot of just garbage out there in the world. This is one of those media bias charts that you see floating around. I also hate these and think that they're massively oversimplified as a side note, but when I'm talking today about the media, what I'm mostly going to be referring to is general interest publications that are focused on news reporting. So factual coverage for a general audience rather than opinion stuff or sports or kind of infotainment, though those are obviously all part of the milieu these days and play into things. And what I want to start with is kind of a local national nexus, because I think this is not well understood outside the industry necessarily, but local news is the linchpin of kind of the entire national news media ecosystem. And these are my little braggy photos from our newsroom from 2020 and 2021. That's me grilling Kate Brown about school closures, and my colleague Safara covering the Beachy Creek wildfire. So local journalists are the ones who are monitoring, the day-to-day of what's happening in city council meetings, county government, and national news relies on that. And I don't just mean kind of the third tier aggregator websites or places like Huffington Post that rewrite a lot of things, but everywhere, New York Times, Washington Post, they are counting on us all having eyes and ears on the ground to flag when things are interesting or unique or part of a larger trend, and they're watching what us local folks do in Oregon and every other state in the country to kind of guide their coverage. So that means that the state of the media in Oregon really ultimately affects the state of the national media and how good of a job it does telling the story of the whole country and all the many communities that are part of it. There's also ample research on local news in particular, showing that there are a bunch of civic goods that go along with having strong local media, and particularly newspapers. Some of that is more amorphous, just better civic cohesion. People working from a common set of facts is important, and I think increasingly rare in our world. And while sometimes that seems like it's impossible to get to at the national level, I see that a lot at the local level, where people who I know absolutely hate each other and disagree on everything will both email me after I write about what the city council's doing and thank me for covering it, and tell me how my story reinforces all of their pre-existing opinions, which are diametrically opposed to each other. And that's always kind of funny. But there's also really tangible benefits to local news. Cities that have strong local newspapers have lower borrowing costs because they're generally better run, more efficient when they have to be accountable to the public, and when government officials are expecting and proactively plan for getting tough questions about what they're doing and how they're spending money. One really concrete example of this from my career was during COVID school closures. So this is an excerpt from a story I wrote in November 2020 about students failing classes. And this was, we were 6 or so months into schools being closed. The fall of 2020, we started with pretty much all Oregon schools online. And I was really trying to be attuned to what is that going to mean? I've covered schools long enough to know that a lot of kids were not going to be showing up, not going to be engaging. And sure enough, I talked to a local high school principal, and he says, yeah, we've got 3 or 4 times the number of kids we'd normally expect failing classes. So I wrote that story, published in November. December 6th, the Associated Press comes out with a story that's the same story, but nationally. So they're saying this is happening all over the country. And they interviewed the same high school principal I did, and cited that same number a couple weeks later. And they don't share this to say that this is some sort of plagiarism or anything bad. This is exactly how the local national nexus should be working. But, national education reporters were looking to all of us covering our individual districts, our individual regions, to spotlight these issues and say hey, this is happening. It's happening in Oregon. It's happening in Houston. It's happening in New Mexico. Let's do a national story about it. And that's often how these things work. So local news is really important, and local news, hot take alert, is not doing so great. I don't think this is a huge surprise to everyone, but I wanted to throw a few numbers here. 1940, we had a US population of 132 million, and newspaper weekday circulation was 41 million. 2020, US population has not quite tripled to 329 million. Newspaper circulation almost halved to 24 million. So we're reaching a lot fewer people than we used to. And there's many reasons for this. So kind of the brief chronicle of the fall of media is, in the early 2000s, and then exacerbated by the Great Recession, there was a big shift as things moved online. Newspapers were really slow to adapt to that, really slow to build websites, really slow to reach readers online. And print newspaper revenue is still the bulk of newspaper revenue, the bulk of it is still tied to the print product, and that remains true today in many places. And print newspaper revenue was heavily subsidized by advertisers. That ad money has not translated to the digital space. It's a much, much smaller amount of money that you're able to get. And so that means that publications have had to really shift to subscriber supported models and downsize significantly in response to those economic pressures. And, some of that was stuff that no one could have predicted. A lot of it was the industry not innovating and being slow to adapt. And then when the Great Recession hit, there was a huge round of media layoffs and jobs that in general haven't come back. So now we're in kind of this hard place where for a lot of legacy papers, there's still a huge reliance on print, even as print continues to shrink. And while people are trying to do digital subscriptions and support that, it's hard to make that work at scale unless you're the size of the New York Times or the Washington Post, or unless you're really, really small, which is something that we've found success with in Salem. But so that's kind of been the last 20 or so years in the industry. And then now we're in a position where I think a lot of the bleeding has slowed, but there's been a huge amount of consolidation and corporate takeover of newspapers. So we're in an era where papers across the US are increasingly owned by hedge funds or big corporations that pay their executives very lavishly and cut jobs and gut the actual, journalism being done. Gannett, of course, is a big offender here and one of the largest local newspaper company in the US. In Oregon, they own the Statesman Journal and the Register Guard in Eugene, which are increasingly merging to become one paper. And often, and this is the really unfortunate part, they will end up cutting at newspapers even when they are profitable, just because they're not turning enough of a profit and because the company is loaded down with debt from previous mergers and acquisitions. So a lot of the cuts to journalism that we're seeing now are less about the business model working and more about just kind of top heavy corporate or hedge fund expectations of profit and really like greed more than that, which is really unfortunate. So what does that all mean in Oregon? Things are not great. Some things are going well, some things are not going well. So these are a couple examples that I thought of just when I was trying to think about the state of Oregon media. I mentioned the Statesman Journal previously. That's, at Salem Reporter, that's our main competition. That's the daily paper that's owned by Gannett. So they're the daily paper in the state capital, and they don't employ a legislative reporter because Gannett had a round of layoffs in December, and they cut their education reporter and their legislative reporter. And Oregon also, I think, there's a lot of good and a lot of bad here. We've seen all these same trends. There's also a lot of growing. Like OPB is one of the biggest newsrooms in the state and has been growing and expanding and adding a lot of new positions, which is great. They're kind of like their own little juggernaut now. But I think, in the time I've lived in Oregon, I've seen a lot of consolidation of really talented journalists flowing toward the Portland metro area. Which is great for, the people who move and are able to get a living wage, but that's really hard for the rest of the state that is dealing with kind of turnover and new people coming in. And when I started on the Society of Professional Journalists board, we worked really hard to have a representative board of people around Oregon. We had someone in Ashland, someone in Bend, someone out in Hermiston, a couple in Portland, me in Salem. One in Eugene, but we had a pretty good spread around the state. And within about 2 years, pretty much everyone on that board who was outside of the Portland metro area had either left journalism or moved to Portland to take a job at OPB. And that's something I think that we see a lot. So that's a big factor here. There's also been kind of a hollowing out of newsrooms. And what I mean by that is when you see layoffs and cuts, often they're the sort of middle tier of the newsroom. So you have a couple senior reporters who've been there forever and know the city really well and have somehow dodged every other round of cuts and layoffs, who stay. And then you have a lot of new reporters who are maybe 2, 3, 4 years out of college and work really hard, who get to stay because they're paid nothing to do what they do. But you see a lot of newsrooms kind of losing that middle tier of people with like 7 to 15 years experience. The last round of Statesman layoffs was, that crew that was left in the newsroom. And that's really hard because if that continues, what you end up with is a trend where you have newsrooms that technically employ journalists who are doing journalism, but you miss out on people who have the background and the context and the depth of local knowledge to really dig into issues, or to remember, like, hey, 3 years ago, the city, took on this big initiative to house people. Like, how is that actually going? We should probably check in about that. So there's a big loss of institutional knowledge when you have, publications that remain open, but don't pay enough for people to continue to work there, or just aren't invested in kind of retaining people. And, y'all are a smart, civically engaged group, so I probably don't need to spell this out, but this, of course, matters for you and for the way that you can engage with your government and the world around you. It means, there's fewer eyes on government meetings, there's fewer eyes watchdogging what people are doing. I think, like Portland City Hall, Salem, the state legislature still have people covering them, but a lot of smaller sheriff's offices, police departments, county commissions, random water boards that don't do that much until suddenly they do something really important. Those kind of things get lost in that shuffle. And that also means that we have less ability and time to be proactive about investigating things, about really looking out and scrutinizing wrongdoing. We often instead are waiting for there to be audits or other things like that. Something saying something wrong has happened here, or investigations from, government ombuds people or other things like that. And then following up on the heels of that, or waiting till there's some scandal or issue at a governing body to go cover it, rather than having someone who's there all the time and really knows the issue. And ultimately that means that less information gets out, and there's less context to it when it does. So that's my grim stuff. Sorry, my slides are going slow. There we go. Okay. So within Oregon, there's kind of Portland and everywhere else, to massively oversimplify. So Portland has a decent network of media outlets, right? You've got the Oregonian, you've got 2 alt weeklies, you've got 3 network TV stations, there's OPB, and I'm sure that there are publications. I'm missing Street Roots. I'm missing plenty of other things on here that are kind of smaller or more niche. So like when Salem Reporter was starting, our boss is Les Seitz, who is a longtime, like 50-year Oregon investigative reporter who is at the Oregonian, and he's like, yeah, I did not look at opening something in Portland because the Portland media market is saturated. But I'm sure, especially for those of you who live in Portland, you can probably think of all kinds of things that you don't feel are getting covered well or covered enough, or things that are slipping through the cracks, even with all these outlets, because realistically, all of them are operating with fewer resources. And I think there's a shift toward, outlets prioritizing stories that can turn quickly in a day, rather than having the resources to really dig into something, except for, a few times. And there are still great investigative reporters at the O, at OPB, at Willamette Week, doing important things, but there's less of that. There's still fewer eyes on things. So you've got solid investigative chops, you've got a lot of news happening, but a lot is left alone. And yeah, I mean, it's not ideal. And this doesn't really consider too that there's a lot of niche communities and things that aren't really included in this. So like Portland is not a news desert by any share of the word, but if you're a non-native English speaker in Oregon, you know, there's really not a lot of news out there for you at all that's targeted toward that. There's, you know, a Univision affiliate in Portland, and there's like a community Spanish language radio station that's based in the Salem area, but there's not much else in Spanish or in other languages that's really covering local Oregon news for people. So outside of Portland, Oregon actually does better than many states as far as media coverage. And we're unique in kind of a couple ways. So this is a map from, there's like a US, if you Google US news desert map, you'll come up with this website, but it maps where there are news deserts. So basically places, counties with no newspaper, and then counties with only one newspaper. So the counties in red there have no newspaper. The counties in yellow have only one. And this is from, I believe, 2018. So it's a little bit out of date. The picture is perhaps a little different now. But most counties in Oregon do have a newspaper covering them, including the really rural ones. That's rare. Malheur County, the southeasternmost one there, has 2 newspapers covering it. And that's, you know, one of the smaller, most rural counties in the state. One of those is my boss's other publication, which is a weekly out there that does a lot of solid reporting. So one reason that Oregon is not unique here, but Oregon, I think, has a stronger media landscape outside Portland, partially because a lot of our smaller papers are locally owned, which is rare. EO Media, which owns the Bend Bulletin and the, oh my gosh, the East Oregonian, same name. East Oregonian out of Pendleton is their flagship paper. But they own a lot of these smaller publications and have kind of bought them up. When the Bend Bulletin went up for sale a couple of years back, there was a lot of concern it was going to be bought by a hedge fund or someone who was going to gut it. And then when EO bought it, that was exciting for everyone that it was going to stay in at least somewhat local hands. There's also Pamplin, which publishes the Portland Tribune and owns a lot of the kind of smaller papers, at least in the Tri-County area and down into Woodburn. So Oregon has been lucky in that regard, that a decent share of our newspapers and publications are owned by people who actually care about journalism and not just throwing money at executives. But a lot of this still contends with, you know, the challenges I talked about earlier. There are it's really, really hard for these publications to pay people a living wage that enables them to stay there unless they're fresh out of college. Outside the I-5 corridor, like Portland area, Salem, Eugene, a lot of these publications are like 1 to 3 really dedicated people, and the owner may be someone who's, you know, nearing retirement and doesn't have a replacement. The thing that I think also people may not necessarily realize is a lot of rural newspapers are actually profitable. Rural newspapers tend to do really well because there's still a civic interest in them, and they're kind of the right size for their market, where you have enough of a base of people there to support them that they're able to turn a profit. But the challenge is convincing someone, when that owner wants to retire or get out of the business or dies or whatever, the challenge is convincing someone who has journalism chops to move to Malheur County or Grant County or wherever and buy that paper and run it. So not all the pressures on the industry are financial. Some of them are just, you know, the same issues that a lot of other rural communities and industries confront about people wanting to leave for larger areas. Oregon is also seeing a lot of new outlets cropping up to fill holes, and these are also generally kind of small, scrappy shops. They're usually digital. Some are nonprofit news, so generally funded by donors and grants. Some are subscriber based, including us at Salem Reporter. We're not a nonprofit. We charge for subscriptions, and we have built that into a sustainable business model over the last 5 years, which is really cool and less stressful now that I don't have to worry that my job's going to evaporate like every month. And so a lot of these are kind of 3 to 5 reporters and a more narrow focus. So publications, that are not trying to be newspapers. We don't have sports sections. We don't have crosswords. We're generally covering hard news, and we kind of pick and choose what we're doing because we can't be everywhere and do everything. So there's us, Salem Reporter. There's the Rogue Valley Times, which is an interesting one. I don't know how much attention this got outside of journalism circles, but the Medford Mail Tribune, which was the daily paper down there, closed right at the beginning of the year, or maybe at the very end of 2022. Laid everybody off and just pulled up shop. And within a month, I think EO Media decided that they were going to launch a new paper called the Rogue Valley Times, and they pretty much just hired all the Mail Tribune staffers. So that was really cool to see, because we all thought we were going to lose a newspaper in Southern Oregon, which is already an undercovered area. And then that came bouncing back, which is great. The Oregon Capital Chronicle is an arm of States Newsroom, which is a national nonprofit that's been putting up newsrooms in state capitals around the country. And they do a lot of legislative and state government coverage based out of Salem as well. And their stories are always not paywalled, and they're always free for other outlets to share, which is really nice. So they kind of act as sort of an Associated Press or wire service for publications that can't afford to do that for themselves. And then Ashland.news is a new nonprofit news site down in Ashland that that's been employing some journalists who were victims of other layoffs down there. And again, just doing that kind of bread and butter civic coverage of what is going on in Ashland. So there is, I think, reason for hope and optimism there. With some of these new publications, like it is still a fraction of jobs that have been lost at newspapers in the last 20 years, but we are starting to build back some of that muscle. And part of what's happening there too is there's a lot more collaboration and interest between outlets, which I think is ultimately good for the public. Competition is helpful, and it keeps us on our toes, and it keeps us kind of focused on what matters. But I think past 2, maybe 3 outlets covering the same exact story, there's diminishing marginal returns there. Different journalists will ask different questions and prioritize different angles, but we can also do a lot more when we team up with each other or share ideas. And that's something you'll see with like in the last governor's race, there was a group that the Oregon Capital Chronicle put together of, I want to say 7 or 8 newsrooms that were all outside the Portland metro area. And we divvied up topics to interview the 3 gubernatorial candidates on. So each outlet took one. We all did interviews with the 3 of them. I did education and talked to the 3 candidates. Actually, I think I was the only reporter who actually got an interview with Christine Drazen. She blew everyone else off, but I was persistent. And so what that meant is that, the tiny newspaper down in Medford got to run 8 like well-reported stories explaining what the candidates thought about abortion policy, about housing, about education, which is something that they and us and none of these publications would have been able to have on their own, but all of our audiences got a better look at the race and hopefully at issues that were important to them. So it's heartening to see more publications like that and more people willing to help each other out. I think some of that is sort of a survivor syndrome thing of like those of us who are still here feel like we have more of an obligation to be helpful because we're all in this together and dealing with the same pressures. There's also been an expansion of some investigative reporting outlets that are not based in Oregon but cover here. So Investigate West, I have their logo up there. They're based out of Seattle, and their editor is in Spokane, but they're covering the Pacific Northwest, so Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and have a reporter based in Salem. So they're doing more kind of regional investigative reporting. And ProPublica, who some of you may be familiar with, nonprofit investigative outlet that's grown quite large over the last decade. They're based in New York, but they are now opening up a shop in the Pacific Northwest and looking to hire reporters in Washington and Oregon. I don't think they've launched yet, but that's coming soon. So that's more eyes and more people doing that kind of in-depth work, and I'll be really excited to see what happens there. So that's kind of the outlet picture for the industry. As far as actual journalists go, sorry for the bloody photo, but I do think it's important. So we're dealing with a lot of stuff on the ground. That's a photo of Edgar Campuzano, who used to be the ed reporter at the Oregonian. He's now in Minneapolis at the Star Tribune, but that was him after, I think, getting hit in the head with a rock or something while covering a protest. There's been, quite a lot of assaults on journalists. That's been really ramping up in recent years and kind of peaked in 2020 during a combination of the George Floyd protests and then just a lot of political instability and violence. I was the only reporter in my newsroom that year who was not assaulted by Proud Boys at a protest at any point, which is because I was mostly in the newsroom editing. And in addition to actual assaults, and a lot of this was concentrated in Portland, but you had a lot more reporters getting tear gas, getting shoved, just being ordered to disperse or leave areas unconstitutionally, which we filed a federal lawsuit over and won. So there's a lot of stress and tension that comes from that. I think it's on a downswing now, but the 2020, 2021 years were really rough and took a toll on a lot of people. I saw more people probably leaving journalism during those years voluntarily than I've seen at any point in my career. We're also not well trusted by the public. So, sorry, that's next. Our approval rating for people who say that they trust the media is at about 36%, which I think is still better than Congress, but not great. Local news, though, does much better than that. The share of people who say that they trust their local newspaper or local outlet is actually quite high, which is nice. And we also, a lot of us are just overworked and tired. Like, I don't know hardly a single reporter except maybe at the O who has a beat that is just one thing that they cover. Like I am the managing editor, I'm our education reporter, I'm our nonprofits reporter, I do backup city hall coverage, and I also kind of cover business and the economy and like state government stuff when it happens. And my other two coworkers have equally amorphous beats because that's just how it has to be. There are not enough bodies to do the work. We're mostly working without copy editors or copy desks. Like, we're writing our own headlines, we're proofreading our own stories. We're often shooting our own photos as well. And we work really hard to not be sloppy and to not be stupid. But as I'm sure you've all seen, like there are more typos in publications these days than there ever have been. I always try to ensure that when I make a mistake, it's a stupid mistake, like a typo, and that the actual facts of the story and the overall vibe of it is correct. But, we are stretched pretty thin, and that makes it hard for people getting into the profession as well, who kind of have to be able to work at a pretty relentless clip to stay here. And yet we are weirdly happy. This was a Pointer. Pointer's a publication out of Florida that covers the news industry. So they wrote about this Pew study recently, and most journalists were very pessimistic talking about all the pressures and issues that we face, and yet most of us still really want to be here and do the work that we do. And when I was thinking about that, it didn't really surprise me, because I think that's something that all of us feel is like a deep sense of commitment to the mission. I mean, you run into it in a lot of nonprofit and public service sectors as well. Like, if there was ever anyone in journalism for the money, those days are long gone. And, you know, we're not really here for the prestige either, because it's, you know, you're as likely to just get called fun names on Twitter or over your email as you are to get any sort of like accolades. So we're here because we care about the work and we believe in what we're doing. And that's something that's really nice and really, I don't know, it makes it easier to deal with all the nonsense and all the things. Like on a good day, I get to get up and hear from someone who has a problem or an issue. Like recently, a woman reached out to me because she was on welfare and she got a letter from the state saying like, hey, you're going to get like $200 on your benefits card to buy clothes. Like, isn't that cool? And she got really excited because she's unemployed, struggling single mom, and told her daughter like, hey, I'm going to be able to get you some back to school clothes. And then it turned out that the state sent that letter in error and had not bothered to tell her that. And I got to email DHS and say like, hey, what happened here? And they said, oh yeah, we accidentally sent that letter to like 20,000 people. And I'm like, well, have you told them that? No, we're developing a trauma-informed communication. I'm like, okay. And so I can't fix that, but I listened to this woman. I got her an answer on what had happened. I wrote a story about it. The governor read it and was like, yeah, no, this is not okay. We need to provide better customer service to people. And I assume went and yelled at the agency head. And I got emails from a lot of other people who'd gotten the same letter accidentally and said like, oh yeah, like you are the first thing that we've seen that explained this to us, or, you know, tried to give us any kind of answer, because I've been calling the office and can't get through to anyone, or my caseworker's ignoring me. And so those kind of things are really, really important. And I think kind of guide, you know, people like me to do what we do. And I know that might sound corny, but like it's very cool to me that my job on a given day is to wake up and like bug people for information. Because it's what I would be doing anyway, whether I was paid to do it or not. And it's exciting. Like I'll be sitting around talking with friends and they'll say like, oh, I wonder what's happening with this thing or what's going on here. And I'm like, oh yeah, I should do a story about that, huh? So that's really, really nice. And so I want to talk a little bit about where you all come in as, you know, informed members of the public who I hope in theory want to support good journalism. Because of all the business things I talked about earlier, and just kind of the decline of print ad revenue and then online ad revenue being a very, very small share of what print was, publications, regardless of their business model, are more dependent on subscribers and donors and supporters than we ever have been at any point in the past. That's a big, big part of how we make money now. Unless you have, you know, the sweet like George Soros money, which we don't. So, you know, like don't blindly throw money at journalism, but figure out like who's giving you information that is useful to you. Who do you think is enhancing your life and your ability to understand the world, and go subscribe or support them in whatever way that you're able to, including encouraging other people. Like if people don't pay for news is not going to be around. And it's especially hard in an environment where quality information and news takes time and resources and money to get. And, you know, disinformation and nonsense and propaganda is abundant and free and available everywhere. So, you know, we need members of the public to step up and support us and advocate for our industry as well. We also need you to hold us accountable. And what I mean by that, like, I love getting emails from our readers. Like sometimes I get emails from people who clearly have no idea what's going on and have never read us, but far more often I get emails from people who are like, hey, I've been reading you guys for a while, and there's many, many versions of that. Sometimes it's, and I have this question, or I haven't seen a story about this and I feel like you should look into it. or like, hey, I normally like what you do, but this article or this headline or this phrase I think missed the mark, and here's why. I absolutely adore getting those emails because A, it tells me people are paying attention to what we do and think it's important, which is like the highest compliment I could ever receive. And B, like, I need to know from the people that we are serving whether or not we are meeting their needs. Like if someone feels like we did something incorrect, or they didn't get what they were looking for out of a story, like, hey, I came hoping to find this information and it wasn't there, that helps me do better next time, and that helps me tweak things. And so much of what I do and what our newsroom does is driven by the things people ask us about and the questions that they have. And that also lets us go to the city council or the police chief or whoever and say like, hey, we're going to be hard asses about this thing that we want to know about, and we're doing it because we've gotten 50 emails from people who are like, you need to figure out what the hell's going on here because I'm mad about it. So when we can act on behalf not just of the public that we imagine in our heads, but the public that actually exists and is in our inbox, like, that's a really cool, really powerful thing. And we see people respond to that. Like, there have been times when the city's slapped us with like thousands of dollars of public records fees, kind of hoping that we'll just quietly go away. And we let our readers know, and they have often chipped in to cover those costs for us so we can keep doing what we do. And that's really, really cool to see. And, not every outlet works like that. It's going to depend on size and context, but like, journalists are people. We're not just amorphous bylines. And in general, like, we want to know what is important to you and what you think is getting missed or uncovered. That welfare story I mentioned earlier, like, that mom reached out, and I think the biggest emotion she had when I talked to her was like surprise that anyone cared. And I'm like, you just told me about an error the state made that affected 20,000 people that I wouldn't have known about if you hadn't messaged us on Facebook. Like, of course I want you to reach out with that. But I think people don't always know that we want to listen and want to share those stories. So that is my corny pitch. And then I think I'm about at time for questions. So would love to talk about whatever you all want to talk about.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for your work and for an engaging presentation this morning. I feel like society hasn't really had a quality discussion about how the pandemic has changed our lives. And for me, and I'm sure many other people, just trying to get a hold of a company to resolve an issue or a government agency, there seem to be so few people working. And I think that journalists play a key role in that. You sometimes have back channels to resolve issues that we can't resolve. So my question is, how much do you notice? I mean, is it just us out here as non-journalists?
No.
How much do you notice, like, there used to be people doing these jobs and now there's no people?
Yes, no, there used to be people doing stuff and now there's no people is like a huge theme of the world that we are in now. And you're absolutely right. That's hitting government. I mean, I notice it as a private citizen when I'm trying to get stuff fixed. And I think it is a really untold and undertold story in government. I mean, there's been huge shifts in the economy with a lot of people resigning and things. So no, it's not just you. And yes, that is a function journalists can sometimes serve is, if your story is, I had this issue with a government agency, I tried to get through, I couldn't reach anyone. That is something we can write about. I think pretty much every state agency in Oregon is wildly understaffed, and that's part of what's going on with the SEIU contract negotiations now. And you're reminding me that I had like 2 incomplete story ideas floating around in my head about that. So I'm going to probably put that a little higher on my list. But yeah, I think, did I answer your question? Like, it is not just you. We see this.
You reassured me on the issue, and thank you for that. Okay, let me go to the chat. It appears that we have a majority of our questions from the Friendly House. So we'll start with our live audience and step up to the mic and ask your question. We have Dave Gray coming to the mic.
I have a comment and a question. The comment is, when I read the brief description of your presentation online, I thought, well, which media is she talking about? Because I think we've all seen generalization between news media and social media. Oh, they're all liars and stuff like that. So I just want to suggest that when you start your presentation, you say, this is about the news media. And thank you for all that very interesting details about exactly what it's like in the news media world. Okay, now my question is, you said that the circulation in the year 2020 had reduced way down to 24 million, but I think you're talking about printed papers only.
Yeah.
So now I'm wondering if you have data that shows what the online interest level is in the Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and so forth.
I don't have that at the tip of my hand. I mean, I know it's increasing. The challenge that the industry has, right? And the point I was trying to make there is more about the business side of things. So even though there are more readers and more people reading digitally, that is not translating into revenue in the way that print readership used to, which is the challenge we're facing. I think that's those outlets you mentioned, the really big national ones, are the ones that have seen success because they have such a huge audience and converting people to digital. And like New York Times, Washington Post, digital subscription growth has been huge, though it's tapering off now that Trump is no longer in office. That was a big boost in subscriptions for those guys. But yeah, that is the tricky conundrum we're dealing with, is how much revenue is still tied to print, even though print is increasingly not how people consume the news.
Well, I used to subscribe to the New York Times every day, and we cut it down to the Sunday Times only. So that's an example of what's happening.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, we've got Al at the mic. Al is known for his complex and challenging questions. You've got a quality journalist here ready for you, Al. Go ahead.
Okay, you mentioned that having a good solid local newspaper makes a city a better place. If I just look out the window, I see Portland had for many years the Oregonian, and it was not the ideal city, but nobody knew. What did we do wrong that we had such a corrupt government forever? We still don't know anything that's really happened on the inside in the last 20 years. That's the way it's always been in Oregon, that this stuff only comes out after a really long time, and that there's lots of ugly underneath. So what did we do wrong to not get the advantages of having such a strong local newspaper?
Well, the advantages I'm talking about were more, I mean, literally like government bond borrowing rates, which I don't know what Portland's are right now. I don't think a local newspaper is a cure-all for every kind of civic issue and things. Portland's government structure, I am not an expert in Portland because I have never lived there and I've never covered Portland government, though a bunch of my friends do, but the commission structure is like very weird and very unique, and I think leads to a lot of the governance challenges that y'all see, because it doesn't make any sense. Like, you have a combo, all of your elected roles are this like weird combo of legislative and executive, and it's very confusing. So I want to say that's part of the issue. But I also, I don't know. I mean, I think that's a lot of the historic stuff. Portland is obviously struggling right now for a lot of reasons. I might be biased and just like a hippie or whatever. I don't think what's going on in Portland is markedly different than what's going on in other US cities. I mean, I think you see a lot of the same problems in like other big cities, San Francisco, Seattle. You've got to I mean, we just had a pandemic, and as Todd said earlier, we haven't really grappled with that, but that had a huge amount of rippling effects on like housing stability, on drug use. Like, a lot of people started using more because there was more isolation and more like stuff going on. I know everyone wants to put it on measure 110 for Oregon, but like Seattle and like other big cities are seeing the exact same thing. We're seeing like fentanyl overdoses and drug use rising everywhere, not just in Oregon. So I don't know that 110 is the actual reason for that. I think it's a pretty convenient scapegoat. And I'm not saying it doesn't play in at all, but I think it's more complicated than that. But yeah, I mean, I cannot speak to the last 20 years of what the Oregonians been doing. I think also like one of the disadvantages that Portland maybe has as the hub for Oregon and the biggest city is like when the O was a bigger and better paper, it was also covering stuff statewide and covering the state capital, and like flexing its muscles as a real statewide paper. And I wonder, I don't know this, but I wonder if that means that like you get proportionally less truly local coverage because you've got bodies trying to cover that big expanse of the whole state and the capital. So I don't have a positive answer for you, but those are some thoughts off the top of my head to your question.
Hello, really enjoyed your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
When this legislature session or the state legislature session, when the senators, the Republican senators walked out, I really didn't hear much. I mean, we heard a little bit about that, but didn't hear. I mean, that was a horrible thing that happened, that they closed down the session. What happened that the news just didn't go crazy about that it wasn't the leading story in every media? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, that's honestly kind of news to me. So I'm like recalibrating a little. So Oregon Capitol Chronicle that I mentioned earlier, that's a like nonprofit legislative focused outlet. We share an office with them. It was their top story every day during the walkout. And then we were stealing that story pretty much every day, but we're in Salem. And I think that probably plays a role. There has been a big shrinking of the legislative press corps everywhere. Oregon is not unique, but Oregon has definitely seen that as well. Where, you know, every publication used to have someone stationed in Salem at the Capitol, and now that's not the case. There's maybe one person, you know, there's Dirk at OPB, Hillary at the O, but they're also doing other stuff. So I think that's part of it, is that a lot of publications have just one reporter there, or one reporter, and that reporter may not be based in Salem. So it might be like, oh, the legislature shut down, I'm going to go look at other stuff or cover other stuff. I think also there's perhaps a bit of just fatigue about it, because this is what the third or so walkout in the last.
Yes.
And that's not an excuse. Like, I think we as reporters sometimes we fail to remember that stuff that seems normal to us is like still worth covering, or that, you know, something should not become normal just because it's become common. So I think that probably plays in a little as well. And then I would guess maybe the last factor is it seems like I think sometimes we worry about stories being too wonky or too insidery for things. And I'm not sure this is even conscious, but I think there's probably some discussion about like, well, how much does this actually affect people, or how much do people outside the Capitol care? And that was something I know we tried to do in our coverage, was because we don't have a ledge reporter. We kind of cover things from the perspective of people in Salem. So we did a story where we called up like basically all the institution leaders who were in local government and like education and stuff in Salem, and are like, hey, what like totally non-controversial bills that really matter to you are just sitting and gonna die because of this. So we try to do that, but yeah, those are my best guesses for you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, again, really enjoyed your presentation. When I was a kid, I was in the circulation department of a newspaper, and I got a complaint saying I want to cancel my newspaper because I'm tired of this right-wing orientation. And then the next call was, I want to cancel this newspaper because of the left-wing orientation.
Yep.
So exciting kind of experience. You worked from Spokane through the Tri-Cities, I believe, to Salem. What did you find, if anything, different about those newsrooms?
Oh, that's interesting. You reminded me of the last cancellation email I got, which was someone who preemptively unsubscribed from Salem Reporter on May 31st because they were pre-offended about our coverage of Gay Pride Month. Which that was hilarious. So the two newsrooms I worked in before Salem, the Walla Walla Union Bulletin, so not quite the Tri-Cities, and then the Spokesman Review, which is like the second biggest paper in Washington. The main difference is those are newspaper and newsrooms. So we still had a lot of the legacy, like we had a copy desk, we had page designers, we had, sports departments. There was just a lot more breadth to the newsroom than just like news reporters. And that, that meant we were able to do a little more and cover a little more. And it also meant we had a little more backup. Like I would often get calls in Spokane from the copy desk at like 10 or 11 at night when I'd be out drinking with the rest of my newsroom friends, and they'd have some really technical detail question about like, hey, your story says that this happened in this year, and then you say 5 years later here, but it looks like it's 4. And I just wanted to make sure like that was the level they were reading on, and it was really great. And then I'd be like trying to pretend I wasn't drunk and answer their question. Then I later learned that not everyone even answered the phone, and they really liked me and they did not care how much I was drinking. I'm like, okay, cool. So that was a big one. I think because our newsroom is small and because my boss is very hands-off and really like values training journalists and like giving us input, I think we have a lot more, we have oversight on the things I care about. Like I can always get questions answered or talk about, how should I approach a story? Like that's something that we always make time for. And that wasn't always the case at daily papers because it's just like, we got to get the paper out. But then there's also a lot of freedom about what to cover. Like, it's usually like, hey, here's what I'm thinking, here's what I want to do. And we set our own agenda and can decide what's important to readers. And it's really collaborative. Like it's not unusual for us to have 2 or even 3 bylines on a story, even though that's most of the newsroom. Because when there's something big that happens, it's just kind of like everybody pitches in and we work it till it's done, and it doesn't really matter whose name is on the thing. So yeah, it's more of a sort of scrappy team feel, I think, by necessity.
Question number 5, please come to the mic.
Thank you very much. I watched a YouTube video some time ago about some expert on the media and why they thought the media was leaning left more and becoming elite and all that sort of thing. And they talked about how in the good old days, the person who became a reporter was like that troublemaker in class who would, bother everyone and want to, find all the ways of digging into things that would just cause problems. And then over the years, things tended to, and I think they said during the Kennedy administration or something, we kind of started thinking more about education as very important to these reporters. And all the report now, one of the most important qualifications for being a reporter is not being a troublemaker or someone who looks deeply into, what the problems are, but what kind of education they have, et cetera. And so they're coming out of these elite schools and things, and now their pals are the ones that are in government, et cetera. And that's kind of changed the whole character of the press. Do you have any comments on any of that?
I do. I'm curious if that rings true to you. But
Curious about what?
Does that ring true to you?
I thought it was an interesting perspective. I think that's probably part of the story, but I think that, that's oversimplifying things.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. I think that what you've described, I think, is very true, especially at national publications. And I forget this, honestly, being on the West Coast. Like I accidentally had about 3,000 people yelling at me on Twitter one day because I dared to tweet that like wildfire smoke wasn't a national story till it was affecting New York City. And then a bunch of people started replying to me with links to like, we cover wildfires, and it was a link to like 2020 California fire coverage. And I'm like, yeah, Spokane has had smoky skies since 2015. Y'all are proving my point here. Anyway, so yeah, I think there's a network of just sort of eliteness, especially on the East Coast, that applies to media, to government, to think tanks, where like people go to a couple schools and graduate from Ivies and then want to get into a prestigious field. And like, this is not an easy profession to get into if you don't come from money. And I think that's especially like, who can afford the cost of living in Washington, D.C. or New York City on an intro journalist salary, which is maybe $50,000 a year without like parent help or institutional? Nobody. It's insane. Like, I am where I am because my parents paid for my college and I graduated debt free. I could not have afforded to stay in this profession. So that's a huge problem. That's a huge, huge problem. And you see it, I mean, like NPR reporter Nina Totenberg, who like covered the Supreme Court for years and was like buddy pals with like Ruth Bader Ginsburg and other people and like hanging out with them socially, which there's so many things like that nationally. And when I talk to other like local journalists about it, we like lose our damn minds, because it's like we have 10-minute ethical discussions in the newsroom about like, if I go to someone's home and they offer me a cup of coffee, can I take it or not? And, you know, and our general consensus is like, try really hard not to. Sometimes that's not going to work because of cultural reasons, but like, try, you know. I've done a couple interviews with like new immigrant or refugee families, and it's like, okay, this interview is not going anywhere else till I just like accept the cup of tea. So yeah, there is an elitism problem. There's an East Coast bias and concentration problem as well. Like the West is thought of as California. The South and the Midwest are largely ignored, except for when we need to like trot out some random diner to support whatever political narrative like a Washington Post political reporter has already concocted. I'm being a little uncharitable, but like, I don't think I'm totally wrong. And that model you talked of kind of the scrappy questioner, like I struggle with that a lot, because I do think there's value in understanding systems and how they work, and like not just being like, there's a fine line between being the guy who's just like asking tough questions and being the guy who just like is refusing to learn about stuff. There's a couple city councilors I can think of where they're like flirting with that line in Salem, and like sometimes it's helpful and sometimes I'm like, if you read anything I wrote, you would know these things that you're asking the city manager about. So yeah, yes, I think it's a problem. Yes, I think it shapes media. I don't think we have a liberal left bias as much as we have like an institutional and an education bias. Like, I think a lot of journalism is just biased towards institutions and officialdom and establishments, and like norms, if that makes sense. And I think we don't do enough reporting that is for people. And what I mean by that is like and I do this, like the number of stories that I have written about government programs that are from the perspective of the agency and that are saying they're rolling out this new program. It's supposed to serve these people. I interviewed one of these people at their press event who can talk about how they've been helped, blah, 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 blah. I've written that story a lot. The number of stories I've written where, you know, someone reaches out to me and is like, hey, you know, I get Oregon Health Plan and I'm trying to find a healthcare provider and like, I can't. And like this program that is supposed to help me or that the government said would do X is not doing X and someone needs to fix it. Like, we don't do those as much, like user focused stories, and we should. They're harder to do and they're more time consuming. And that's one reason. But like, you know, I think we do need to bring some of that more. I think that's also part of what happens when you have a profession that's like really young, and a lot of people who are fresh out of school is like, you know, the reporters I work with are in their early 20s, and like, no disrespect, I was in my early 20s for a period of time, as we all were. And I'm only 32 now, but like I now own a house, I have a kid, and I do find that those experiences are like shaping how I report more and making me a little more like ornery and a little less like happy with things. Like covering schools feels different now that I have a baby, because I'm like, my kid is going to go to that school. Like, excuse me, you need to fix this. So yeah, that was a lot of rambling, but I think there was an answer to most of your questions somewhere in there.
Okay, I have a follow-up to Dave's question before we get to number 6. It's hard for me to know. I mean, I'm very liberal, very progressive, and I just don't see the liberal media in the same way that it's reported. And I don't see how, when media is owned by large corporations, by definition, they're more conservative that way, in my opinion. But so here's my question. When you put up the chart on the left media, center media, right media, I mean, when I look at something like The Nation, I look at their story like that's a well-researched story that Republicans just don't like. And then I look at OAN or Newsmax and I'm like, that's a conspiracy story with no facts whatsoever. So the two sides of the media don't seem to be comparable at all to me. And I just wondered what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, pretty much agree. I fucking hate those charts. They drive me absolutely up a wall, because here's what I think is actually important when evaluating a media source. Like, political orientation is so much more complicated than left, right. I mean, there's liberal conservative, but there's also like institutional and non, right? Like there's conservative institutionalism, there's liberal institutionalism, and then there's like libertarian whatever and anti-establishment stuff, and you have that on the left and the right. But yes, like I think one of the main criteria for evaluating a news source is like, do they actually do reporting? And that's a lot of what's missing there. Like The Nation does original reporting. They talk to people, they evaluate research, they do it from a progressive perspective, but they are doing journalism. OAN is not doing journalism, they are doing propaganda. And they are, often either outright making things up or just, like it's and I'm trying, like, there are some conservative outlets that do actual news reporting from a conservative perspective, and there's Reason is my go-to, which isn't conservative, it's libertarian, but like they do actual reporting. They do a really good job bringing to light particularly like law enforcement abuse cases and like local government like tax seizure stuff that's absolutely horrible that someone should be covering, and they do reporting on it. Whatever you think of their commentary and their writers, like there is journalism happening there. So that's like, is there a liberal bias in media? Like, to the extent, if you look at the party registration or affiliation of most working journalists, like, yes, they're overwhelmingly Democrats or left-leaning. But I agree with you. I think there's institutional, bias and elitism to the last question. Like, if everybody in media comes from wealth and privilege and went to an elite school, it doesn't really matter whether they vote for Biden or Trump. I mean, it does, but like that is a way of seeing the world that's going to inform their coverage. So yeah, I don't think media bias charts are helpful. I don't think bias is really a useful perspective for understanding news. Like, I think it's about quality. I think it's about understanding like quality of reporting, like sort of lens or thing is informing that reporting. Like, those are the two things I look at.
Okay, thank you. Dave McMillan, I see your hand up, and we will get to you right after we get to questioner number 6 at the mic.
Thank you. I really enjoyed your talk. Many of us in this room and on Zoom sort of grew up with the old style journalism, with the where you're supposed to have two independent sources for any news story that's published, and that the deadline that you had was the publication of the newspaper. Nowadays, the deadline is like how fast you can type and get something online. And so it would seem to me that that's changed the whole if not role of journalism, certainly the practice of journalism, because there are so many fewer time constraints, and there's this push to get things out before the next person. Now, that may not be as big a case with local news as it is with national news, but it still seems like it is flavored journalism to promote sensationalism rather than necessarily thoughtful coverage of important stories. And so I just wonder whether in the time that you've been in the business now for over a decade, have you seen it growing more towards sensationalism? And is there a way that as a news organization you can combat that? You can tell your people, we have to be thoughtful and take this at the pace that will give us the most useful information.
Yeah. Everything you described, yes, is happening. I think the sensationalism wave for real news publications, because there's a lot of just chatter and garbage and propaganda on social media, and that is getting worse. But for actual news publications, I think the sensationalism wave actually peaked and we're on a downswing, because I think partially because like the business model that's predicated on is like clicks, right? Like there was an era where we thought that publications like BuzzFeed and like other places could sustain actual news operations just through digital ad impressions, and that was predicated on drawing a lot of clicks. You can't actually do that, and also Facebook was lying a lot about their ad numbers. And we already, that wave crested, and we had a really big round of layoffs nationally about it. So, I mean, there is like, the Supreme Court overturns Roe v. Wade, and it's, like everybody's typing to get that story up as soon as they can. But I think what you see now more is outlets that do try to be fast, but also, get an initial story out, and then we'll often go back and like add context or write it out more. So like the version that you would be reading in the paper the next morning is kind of draft 2 or 3 online. So we're sort of iterating in real time a story. And then I know like we always on the local side, but you see this on like the good national ones too. Like we'll look, okay, we've done this day's story, like the migrant ship sank or the submersible is missing, whatever is going on. What can we in the next 2-3 days report that's going to add context, add depth, set us apart from other people? So I do think you still see that happening with the same constraints of time, but it's not everything is always a rush to get it out first. And I think outlets are decent about doubling back when it's warranted.
We're going to go a little past 11:20 with our questions, as I think our end of meeting announcements will be short. Let's go to Dave McMillan from our Zoom audience.
Hi, Rachel. Thanks for being here. I'm in Salem, and I think an early subscriber to the Salem Reporter.
Thank you.
As a matter of faith, I subscribed early on because there was such a need for another newspaper, an alternative to the Statesman Journal, and I have been very happy with it. So thank you for all that and your reporting.
Thank you.
I'm in your list of Salem or local outlets. I didn't see the Oregon Capitol Insider, which is another news outlet, I think, that focuses on the Capitol, that even our Portland friends might be interested in, since it does cover state government.
Yeah, I was trying to list ones that are new in the last like 2 or 3 years, and I think Dick Hughes has been doing that for a while, but I might be wrong. Is he newer?
I think it was 2015 it came on.
Okay.
So it's been a while, and it is Dick Hughes. Yeah, Dick Hughes used to be the editor of the Statesman Journal.
Yeah, no, he does great stuff though, absolutely, and it's good to see. So there are kind of smaller niche things like that if you know where to look.
Let's go to question number 7 from the Friendly House.
I've got a quick question. You mentioned that you're so short-staffed. Have you ever considered getting volunteers to go to some of these government meetings or board meetings? Just curious about that.
Yeah, we are like, I describe us as scrappy a lot because we're willing to try stuff like that. I mean, for a while, like when our community college had a student paper, I connected with them and I just asked their student journalists if we could steal their stuff covering the Board of Ed because they knew the context better than us. And I'm like, why not let a bunch of 19-year-olds write for us and get a real byline, and I'll give them a real edit on work they'd be doing anyway. We've had, sometimes when we have people volunteer, like I can do that as well. It's a little tricky because like it's hard to maintain the balance of getting help, but also, standards and making sure that people know what they're doing. We have relied on volunteers more for photography and photojournalism. And we've had some retired, like former newspaper reporters in Salem who just proactively reached out and said like, hey, I like what you're doing and I want to help. So we have relied on volunteers from time to time. And I do think that's an underexplored model for journalism. Yeah.
Okay, we are finished with questions from the Friendly House. I'm going to end with this question because I'm very curious. I've tried to be an early adopter of OpenAI, ChatGPT, and other AI technologies. That's definitely helped amateur writers in writing faster. I wonder how AI affects the Salem Reporter and local journalism.
I don't know yet, but I'm not worried. I'm not worried about my job. I am very worried about like the information economy. ChatGPT writes convincing sounding bullshit, right? Like it doesn't think. That's the thing. Like it's a predictive language model. It's not like its job is not to sort of understand a question and provide accurate information. It's not a search engine. Its job is to like take the sum of the language that it has like analyzed and say like, okay, how would this question be answered based on what I know of human language? So it's predictive text. It's very sophisticated predictive text, but like it is not going to give you an accurate response to a question often. And you see this a lot. And so what concerns me the most, like, it's great that people who have jobs where like I've seen examples of people in the trades where writing is not their strong suit, but they need some of that to run a business, can like use ChatGPT to like sound more professional with customers. That's great. Like, awesome, rock on. But I think people who are like saying it can replace journalists are A, like vastly overestimating what the AI can do, and B, like misunderstanding the value of what we do. And I might be naive, but like I think our subscribers get it. Like, you're not paying me, you're not subscribing to pay my salary so that I can like write pretty. I mean, I need to write clearly enough that you know what I'm talking about, but like you're paying me because in my phone right now, I have the cell number for like every city councilor, the superintendent, a bunch of state legislators. And if something goes down, like I know who to call and I can get you some answers. ChatGPT can't do that. And ChatGPT right now cannot like think critically or analyze, questions or things like that. So I don't know. I think it's cool for what it's useful for, but I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about what it is actually designed to do and able to do at this point. And like tech bros have been saying they're going to save journalism forever. And like most of them don't know what they're talking about because every time they've tried, it has not worked. And I'm still here. So
it's hard to be a good journalist if you don't get out of your basement, and a lot of tech people spend time there. So
I am quite literally in my basement right now, but
you have a beautiful basement and you did a beautiful job with the presentation today. Rachel, thank you so much for your work and your insight and knowledge today, and very engaging Q&A as well. So thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me.